Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. Welcome to a virtual panel as part of the Big, Hot, and Sticky exhibition that opened last month at the Houston AI Architecture Center. If you've not checked it out, please do. It will close on 23rd of this month, I think. I'm Deepa Ramaswamy, Assistant Professor of the History of Architecture and Urbanism here at the College of Architecture and Design at the University of Houston. I'm going to give a little bit of intro about the exhibition and then about the panel, after which I'm going to introduce the panelists at the beginning, so then they can go through the research one after the other. Big, Hot, and Sticky spotlights Houston as a novel urban ecosystem, a constellation of highways, waterways, air-conditioned buildings, remnant prairies, and possums. This exhibition invites 7 designers to respond to Houston's provocation through critical histories, design research, and speculative projects rooted in the city's urban landscape. The questions the exhibition asks, of which this panel is a part of, are: how are environments, climates, and cultures co-constructed? What are the futures of this notoriously air-conditioned, car-centered energy capital? What does it look like to thrive in a city that is big, hot, and sticky? Now about today's panel. Histories of swamps, land, and the climate crisis, Gulf Coast formation through value and drainage. As the Gulf Coast faces escalating climate challenges, the historical land use and development patterns have become critical to understanding current vulnerabilities. This panel explores the complex relationship between Houston and the Gulf's swampy origins, land valuation processes, and the unfolding climate crisis. The panel will examine this interplay in 3 parts. First, the historical transformation of indigenous lands into private property through policy and regulation. Second, how drainage governance perpetuated inequities and uneven climate vulnerabilities. And third, current efforts to restore lost swampland and manage climate risks. Central to this discussion is the concept of land value and its role in driving environmental transformation. The panel will explore how past land use and drainage decisions have created disparate climate vulnerability geographies, particularly affecting marginalized communities. We will analyze the mechanisms used to convert swampland into valuable property and the governance practices that led to enduring inequalities. With that, I'll introduce the 3 panelists we're so excited to hear from. The first one is Carrie Gammell, who's a designer, researcher, and educator, currently pursuing a Ph.D. in architecture at the University of California, Los Angeles. She works as a senior research associate at CityLab UCLA and as a teaching fellow at USC, SCIAC, and UCLA. She holds a master in design studies from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and a bachelor of architecture from Rice University. Carrie's doctoral dissertation focuses on the relationship between 19th century land grants and 20th century housing policy. She is more broadly interested in the creation and valuation of property and architecture's role in these processes. Amani Ponnaganti is a Ph.D. student in geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Grounded in feminist, post-colonial, and critical race thinking, her scholarship examines how power relations shape environment, law, and development from a historical perspective. Her writing has been published in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research and South Asia Journal of South Asian Studies. She holds a BA-LLB honors, which is a JD equivalent from the National Academy of Legal Studies and Research in India. Our third speaker is Despo Thoma, AICP, is Director of Resilience at SCAPE. Trained in architecture and urban design, she manages climate adaptation and resilience planning projects with a focus on visual storytelling and equitable approaches to engagement. She has led large-scale planning and infrastructure projects in New York, Boston, the Bay Area, and Southeast Asia. Despo holds a master's in architecture and urban design from Columbia University, where she studied as a Fulbright Fellow and was awarded the GSAP Prize for Excellence in Urban Design. She also holds a bachelor and master's degree in architecture from the National Technical University of Athens and has taught in both the urban design program at Columbia and the College of Architecture and Design at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, NJIT. With that, I'm going to pass the virtual stage to Carrie. Take it away, Carrie.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Deepa, for the introduction, and Dolly and Deepa for the invitation. Make sure I can share my screen. Okay. Can you see everything? Beautiful. Perfect. Okay. And thank you so much, Jennifer, too, for organizing. I was born and raised in Houston, so I'm very happy and honored to be here in this virtual space. I've taken the opportunity to adapt my dissertation research, which focuses on a comparative study of property and land values in Miami and Los Angeles to the context of Houston and the broader Gulf Coast region. I was just telling the other panelists during our sound check that I'm currently in Los Angeles. We experienced a magnitude 4.4 earthquake just a few hours ago, which left my apartment building shaking pretty violently, but everything's okay. Needless to say, the relationship between the natural environment and the built environment is very much at the forefront of my mind today. So with that said, I've titled my presentation, Possession by Deprivation, or How Our Creation and Valuation of Property Defied the Environment. The history of climate change is a history of settlement and cultivation, and ultimately of urban sprawl. 19th century land grants provided the structural foundation for Indigenous land dispossession and low-density residential development. Through these measures, overlapping and nested states produced elite classes of white property owners in some of the most important cities on the United States Gulf Coast. These proprietors in these cities encountered similar issues with the natural environment, namely too much water, be it sea levels or rainfall. But nevertheless, these proprietors improved the land or sought to improve the land, and these cities grew more horizontally than vertically, decimating rich but extremely fragile ecosystems in the process. At the center of this conversation are a few questions. Kind of how do we as Houstonians, as Texans, as Gulf Coasters, as Americans, how do we define property? Why do we define property the way we do? And why are our property laws the way they are? Well, I would say one, the large cities of the region are located on lands that were once occupied by various indigenous peoples, and each of these groups had its own conception of property. Two, the large cities of the region are located on lands that were once ruled by colonial empires, some by England, some by Spain, some by Mexico, some by France, some even by more than one of these. And each of these colonial empires had its own conceptions of property. The large cities of the region are also located on lands that are governed by the states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. Each of these states, especially Texas, which was once a breakaway state, has its own conceptions of property. And in turn, each of these states is governed by the United States. Louisiana joined the Union in 1812, Mississippi in 1817, Alabama in 1819, Florida and Texas in 1845. The United States, too, has its own conception of property. So although the United States is indeed kind of one state, one sovereign political entity, it unites many disparate nations or many disparate groups of people, each with its own conception of property. There is, however, one commonality across all of these conceptions of property, kind of save for the Indigenous conception of property, and that is the requirement that a settler build a house. In the 17th century, the English crown granted a royal charter to the Virginia Company of London, an English joint stock company founded to colonize Virginia. A settler paying his own transportation was entitled to 50 acres of land. The law required him to seat and plant his grant within 3 years in order to perfect the title to the land. Seating, spelled S-E-A-T, according to the law, meant the building of a house, no matter how small, and keeping stock for 1 whole year. Meanwhile, planting, according to the law, meant planting and tending 1 acre of ground, no matter how bad the tract might be. A settler gained possession through his labor, that is, through settlement and cultivation. Later, the English crown concocted similar schemes, granting royal charters to English proprietary colonies in Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, anticipating that settlers would seed and plant that land as well. Then during the 18th and 19th centuries, the Spanish crown offered land grants to anyone who settled their colonies of Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. The law required a settler to take the oath of allegiance to Spain within 3 months and then build a house and cultivate the land within a given time. A settler gained possession through his pledge of allegiance to Spain, but could lose possession of land through his lack of labor, that is, through lack of settlement and cultivation. The United States became a sovereign political entity in 1776 and subsequently acquired English, French, and Spanish territories through various treaties, agreeing to uphold all supposedly valid colonial land grants. However, in 1805, the United States set its own legal precedent for the definition of property. the landmark case Pearson versus Post involved a dispute over which of two men deserved ownership of a fox, but adjudicating the dispute required determining at what point a wild animal becomes property. A New York Supreme Court Associate Justice opined that property is possession via the labor of deprivation, be it of an animal's natural liberty by killing it, or the land's natural liberty by so-called improving it. The United States' new definition of property was not entirely consistent with either England's or Spain's definitions of property, which resulted in years of litigation over the validity of the aforementioned colonial land grants. In an 1845 article published in the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, editor John O'Sullivan urged the United States to annex the Republic of Texas, not only because the Republic of Texas desired this, but also because it was the United States' manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. And that was a quote by John Sullivan. He believed that the United States borders were destined to expand across North America, displacing indigenous peoples and annexing Western lands. If the United States was to become a colonial empire, then it would need a framework for land management. And here I've included these two paintings because I think they depict kind of this similar insatiable hunt, be it for an animal or for land. But Texas already had a framework for land management, one put in place by the Mexican government. The founder of Texas, so-called founder of Texas, Stephen F. Austin, was an American-born impresario. Between 1821 and 1835, the Mexican government contracted impresarios to recruit families to settle in Texas to increase the Anglo-American, Mexican, and European populations, protecting the land from indigenous peoples and potential U.S. purchase. In exchange, impresarios received land grants. In 1821, Stephen F. Austin established Austin's Colony, which we can see in pink. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in pink at the southeast. Austin offered land to settlers at only 12 cents per acre. That's 1/10 the price of comparable land in the United States, so very cheap. A settler, in turn, was to fulfill 4 requirements. He was to be Catholic, to be of good moral character, to improve the land by building upon it, and to cultivate the land within 2 years. Otherwise, the settler would forfeit right to the land. By 1825, Stephen F. Austin had fulfilled the Mexican government's requirements. He led the initial actions against indigenous peoples, and he brought the first 300 Anglo-American families into the territory. In time, however, settlers became increasingly dissatisfied with the Mexican government. Austin advocated conciliation, but the dissent against Mexico escalated into the Texas Revolution. And on March 2nd, 1836, Texas became a breakaway state. The permanent settlement of Houston began not even 6 months later, on August 26, 1836. When real estate promoters John Kirby Allen and Augustus Chapman Allen purchased half a league of land, or about 2,214 acres, from John Austin's widow for $5,000. And just a quick aside, John Austin was one of Stephen F. Austin's aforementioned Old 300, one of those first 300 families. But despite having an identical surname to the so-called founder of Texas, he was only a distant relative. Although the lush green forests of Southeast Texas had been previously inhabited by the Atacapa, Isaaq, and the Karankawa people, the Allen brothers encountered uninhabited land, due in large part to Stephen F. Austin's aforementioned efforts to expel indigenous occupants. Early settlers described the town of Houston as quote, a green scum lake studded with giant sweet gum trees and water from 1 to 2.5 feet deep, end quote. Nevertheless, early promoters announced that, quote, when the rich lands of this country shall be settled, a trade will flow to it, making it beyond all doubt with great interior commercial emporium of Texas, end quote. Brothers John Pettit Borden and Gail Borden Jr. surveyed and laid out the town, bounded by Buffalo Bayou on the northeast, Texas Avenue on the southwest, Bagby Street on the northwest, and Crawford Street on the southeast. And in January 1837, the town totaled 12 residents and 1 log cabin. 4 months later, there were 1,500 people and 100 houses. On December 29th, 1845, the Republic of Texas was annexed into the United States and admitted to the Union as the 28th state. But nevertheless, the state of Texas maintained property laws and land offices separate from those of the United States. In 1845, the state of Texas passed a preemption law influenced by the United States Preemption Act of 1841. Both laws entitled a settler up to 320 acres of surveyed government land, provided that he had already lived on and improved the plot for a period of 3 years. Then he would receive it at a price of $1.25 per acre in the United States and 50 cents per acre in Texas. Then the United States passed the Swamp Land Act of 1850, which provided a mechanism for reverting title of federally owned swampland to states which would agree to drain the land and turn it to productive agricultural use. This law opened additional lands not only in Florida, but also in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama to settlement and cultivation. As far as I know, Texas was not affected by this legislation, but I do think it's helpful to know which laws affected other Gulf Coast states at this time. And then finally, in 1854, the state of Texas passed kind of a pioneering homestead law that would ultimately influence the United States Homestead Act of 1862. Both laws entitled a settler to up to 160 acres of surveyed government land, down from the preemption allotment of 320 acres, so half. He was to live on and improve this plot of land for a period of 3 years in order to perfect title, this time at a price of $0.00 per acre, so free. The United States federal government and the Texas state government valued frontier lands at virtually nothing until a claimant improved them by establishing actual continuous residence thereon, building a house, and plowing, fencing, and cultivating the acreage. Only then could the land be possessed, and only then could the land become property. Possession required not only the transformation of land from natural environment to built environment, but also the transformation of land use from usufruct to ownership. In other words, from the right of use and benefit to the right of exclusive use and benefit. And in other words, from the common to property. Pictured here is a scan of a homestead proof document. Here you could see some of the questions that claimants and witnesses were asked here. When did claimant settle upon the homestead, and at what date did he establish actual residence thereon? Describe the dwelling and other improvements, giving a total value thereof. And question 5, have claimant and family resided continuously on the homestead since first establishing residence thereon? These processes of the creation and valuation of property are still very much active in Houston and Texas, in the Gulf Coast, and in the United States today. On once rural plots and now urban lots sit single-family homes, monuments really to ownership and racial exclusivity, improvement, and financial security. The dredging of Buffalo Bayou from 1871 to 1876 and the construction of the Houston Shipping Channel from 1920 to 1925 constituted so-called improvements to the city, albeit they not residential improvements. One historian remarked in 1926 that the improvement of the waterway and rail the improvement of the waterway and rail and water terminal facilities were of, quote, inestimable value, end quote, to Houston's economy, attracting not only commercial and industrial enterprise, but also settlers from the Midwest and Northeast United States. The wealthiest of the newcomers purchased home sites in the brand new River Oaks development, at the time a suburb that emphasized exclusivity and security above all else. To the west was undeveloped farmland, but to the east was ever-encroaching commerce and industry. Although developers Hugh Potter, Mike Hogg, and Will Hogg offered lots ranging from 15,000 square feet to 4 acres at prices from $1,200, deed restrictions prohibited homes costing less than $7,000, a minimum expenditure that was well beyond the reach of the ordinary buyer. Potter even wrote to a friend, quote, "The object is not merely home sites, but to sell them in such a way as will ensure the permanence and charm of the community and make each estate an asset of ever increasing value," end quote. Their value did increase and continues to increase. River Oaks was so carefully restricted, not only against non-white and Jewish people, but also against commerce and industry, that in time it became the most successful, by some measures, residential enterprise and the most expensive residential development in Houston. Its golf course and expansive lawns absorb runoff, so residences within its borders fare reasonably well against flooding. But at the same time, its low density and car-centric infrastructure divert runoff, so the residential, commercial, and industrial buildings outside its borders are even more prone to flooding. The way in which we historically define property has dictated the ways in which we have since managed land. Although our property laws were motivated by exclusivity and security, in time we may have neither. By 2050, up to $106 billion worth of coastal property in the United States will likely be below sea level. Much of those losses will be Houston properties. Urban sprawl and environmental deprivation are problems of the community, the city, the state, and the nation all at once, and ones that I think must be re-examined from the point of view of mutual inclusivity and vulnerability. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention. As a historian, I do feel like my work often illuminates more problems than it does solutions, so I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was so excellent. So we'll have the discussion at the end. Now we'll go to Amani.
Thank you so much to Dahlia and Deepa and Jennifer for having me. I'm going to present some work from my master's thesis. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My talk today is about the history of drainage and flood control in Houston in relation to race and colonialism. I'm gonna begin with a story that's probably a scene that's probably familiar to many present here today. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey devastated Texas. As floodwaters engulfed the city, almost a third of Houston's landscape was submerged. Harvey killed over 100 people and caused 36,000 people to lose electricity in the state. The hurricane disproportionately impacted Black and undocumented immigrant communities in the cities. I want to juxtapose the spectacular event of the hurricane with the much more mundane kind of flooding from almost a century ago. On December 15th, 1923, a Black child nearly drowned in the 3rd Ward, a majority Black neighborhood in Houston. The boy was saved in the nick of time by a man who saw him fall into the whirling waters. As the city streets turned into raging streams, 3rd Ward residents were forced to find refuge elsewhere until the waters abated. While a cloudburst led to exceptional rainfall that winter day, the flooding itself was not such an exceptional scene in the city's Black neighborhoods. Recounting the almost fatal incident, a prominent Black newspaper noted that, while it is generally agreed that the rain of Monday was the most unusual one, and that it would have taxed the capacity of a city with far better drainage system than Houston, yet something should be done by the city fathers to relieve the deplorable and disgusting conditions existing and obtaining in sections of the city occupied by colored citizens and taxpayers. What Saidiya Hartman describes as the afterlives of slavery continue to determine the calculus of Black life and death in Houston's neighborhoods. For the once swampy landscape that became one of the fastest growing cities in the world, the unequal history of drainage infrastructure shapes climate vulnerability today as disasters become more frequent. What we now understand as Houston's flood control infrastructure, an extensive mundane network of canals, levees, ditches, and drains, first began to be built as part of swampland reclamation projects, like that Carrie mentioned, which work to make land habitable and cultivable for white settlers. In my talk today, I'm going to be describing how race and colonialism shaped environmental governance in Houston by following historical discourses and practices surrounding land reclamation and drainage governance. I place drainage within the geohistorical context of imperialism, plantation agriculture, and industrialization that shaped 19th and early 20th century settler colonial Texas. I show how, while flood control emerges as a discursive paradigm in the 1930s in the wake of disaster, the impetus for drainage as a political project began much before this. I trace the history of Texas's environmental regimes by following these drainage projects from 1900 to 1939. Just to talk a little bit about the kind of work I'm drawing from, it is kind of from geographies of race and colonialism, critical legal studies, as well as environmental history. I draw from work that shows how power and difference are spatial and historical, relational, and fatally dynamic, to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And also historical work that shows how colonialism and white supremacy organizes discourses and practices of property and improvement towards legitimating domination, oppression, and dispossession, and work that demonstrates that legal and political projects working to remake the environment across different imperial colonial contexts during the 19th and early 20th century were rooted in capitalist, colonial, and racial logics. So kind of beginning in the early 20th century, in the 19th and early 20th century, period historians commonly describe as new imperialism to signify the rapid expansion of territorial conquest by European and American empires alongside the spread of industrialization. Trans-imperial civilizational discourses of improvement in public health motivated dramatic environmental transformation through land reclamation and drainage. Like in other colonial contexts, in Houston, law and engineering were critical in producing property landscapes for cultivation and commerce. The Swampland Act of 1850, which Carrie also mentioned, promoted land reclamation in marshy regions and led to increased settlement across different states across the Gulf Coast. Projects of land drainage and reclamation were based in colonial ideas of purity, hygiene, and health. During the early 20th century, hydraulic engineers, water bureaucrats, and businessmen collaborated to influence the federal government to act towards reclaiming land from the marshy regions of the South through drainage, particularly by organizing national and regional meetings on the subject. For example, the National Drainage Congress, which took place in New Orleans in 1912, brought together representatives from different states to collectively campaign for drainage. The Southern Commercial Congress in Nashville similarly also discussed drainage, emphasizing how removing wetlands was central to promoting public health and economic development in the region. And in these meetings, there was like a push towards literally like eliminating swampland, projecting it as a kind of waste. The view of wetlands as a site for economic development through increasing agricultural development was further supported by economists. Ray Teal, who also had experience working for the federal government and was an economist, published the book, The Economics of Land Reclamation in 1927. And this text presented a map of wetlands in the US, which described them as unfit for crops. And these kind of cartographic representations naturalized colonial and capitalist political imaginaries that viewed swamplands as wastelands, which required corrective technologies to make them useful for the nation. In Texas, the state's economic interests to develop carceral plantation agriculture also motivated drainage projects. In 1912, the state's drainage commissioner, Arthur Stiles, wrote a report describing the need for drainage in the Brazos Valley. Here, Stiles articulated the economic costs from floods to agriculture in the state. Stiles strongly recommended that the state should construct a system of levees, particularly for the protection of state convict farms in the region. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, southern states did not have prisons, but instead employed convicts as laborers. In the post-emancipation landscape, Texas was one of the leading states in terms of the number of convicts leased to perform agricultural and industrial labor, arguably continuing slavery through other means. Historian Matthew Mancini suggests the abolition of convict leasing in 1910 was possible due to the absorption of prison labor into state-owned plantations. By 1910, the state owned over 20,000 acres of fertile agricultural land for sugar plantations, including properties in the Sugar Bowl region located in the southwest of Houston. State-owned plantations provided a productive mode for the state to generate profits from convict labor. Drainage here was envisioned as a technology to protect the state's economic interests in carceral plantations. Thus, in the 19th and early 20th century, land and plantations were at the center of the political imaginary and economic rationale, motivating swampland reclamation. But this would change. In 1920, the US government surveyed existing drainage operations across the country, including the subject in the census for the first time. The census revealed that over 65 million acres of land was being drained across the US, with 2 million acres of drained land in Texas at the cost of approximately $6.4 million. Texas's drainage enterprises were primarily located across the marshy and watery terrain of the Gulf Coast, as depicted in this map. As more and more land was claimed by the US in the West and South, flexible techniques of government were required to realize the desires of property owners to transform wetlands through drainage. During the 19th century, special districts emerged as the spatial governmental device to provide the legal and economic structures for such projects to take place. The work of these districts was not only to make property by removing water from land, but also to maintain the constructed boundaries between land and water. In Houston, between 1908 and 1923, 12 drainage districts were organized with different funding for each. The organization and working of drainage districts was uneven, as it was tied to the ability of property owners to fund the construction and maintenance of these projects. As people struggled to raise finances, drainage districts were largely under-resourced. When floodwaters enter the city, it is drainage districts that determine which neighborhoods will be protected and where there will be a higher likelihood of damage. There are two types of drainage districts in Houston: curb and gutter ditches and open ditch drains. While curb and gutter ditches require less maintenance and offer better protection from disasters, communities argue that open ditch drains are often inadequate to safeguard against disasters. Today, most open ditch drains are in neighborhoods where most residents are Black and brown. These patterns are based on historic segregation in the city. So this map depicts how kind of correlates redlining with drainage inequalities. Between 1935 and 1940, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was created by the federal government, rated residential neighborhoods based on whether they were considered safe financial investment. So this discriminatory practice known as redlining exacerbated racial inequalities. And at the same time, Black residents of Houston continually challenged the infrastructural abandonment of their neighborhoods. In the 1920s and 1930s, Black citizens advocated for improving drainage, demanding the city to provide for the health and well-being of people in Black neighborhoods. Black advocates for drainage articulated these demands in the language of rights rather than property. During this period, Black neighborhood associations like the Third Ward Civic Club worked towards ensuring the city took action to improve street sanitation and drainage. Drainage districts are rooted in property logics, with landowners being the agents of environmental transformation. The history of drainage districts shows how we must reckon with both the juridical borders inscribed in the urban landscape, as well as the invisible ways that existing legal forms and political processes exclude and restrict racialized populations from governance. Moving a little bit more forward, in 1935, 25 blocks of Houston's business district downtown were severely damaged as the worst flood in the city's history until that point struck. In the wake of the flood, a modernized regime of flood control emerged in Houston during the New Deal era, replacing the decentralized drainage districts of the early 20th century. Ostensibly, This mode of governance constituted a discursive break from the language of farm drainage that shaped earlier environmental management to make wetlands into cultivable and habitable landscapes for white settlers. During this moment, aside from the buildings and offices that were inundated by the floods, the rural past of settler colonialism became submerged by modern visions for the future city. After the flood, political and economic elites mobilized the expertise of engineering to legitimate the emerging flood control regime. This expertise was embedded within and constrained by considerations related to growth and development of the city, property acquisition, available funding, and perhaps most critically, the protection of the Houston Ship Channel. During the early 20th century, Texas's oil boom dramatically transformed cities in the States, perhaps none more so than Houston. During this period, an elite coalition comprising of commercial actors lobbied for government subsidies to develop Houston's port. They convinced the US Congress to spend almost $1 million in 1902 and then again lobbied for further funding in 1910 to support building the Houston Ship Channel. Today, the Houston Ship Channel is a key node sustaining the movement of fossil fuels in the global economy. It's the largest port along the Gulf Coast, where more than a third of US crude oil exports travel to destinations across the world. In the 1930s, officials at the Port of Houston played an important role in shaping the terrain of flood control. Importantly, navigation, which meant ensuring that the ship channel was not compromised and indeed protected through flood control, became coupled with flood control itself. An expert group called the Harris County Navigation and Flood Control Committee worked to reconcile the tensions between port officials with engineers and bureaucrats towards engineering a consensus that would ensure diversion away from the ship channel is what made most sense for preventing future floods in the city. As the director of the Port of Houston said during the time, there are a lot of engineers in this vicinity who believe that if the Houston Ship Channel were extended up to the center of town and its dimensions made wide and deep enough to carry all the water without flood, that our problem would be solved. And all of these ignore the navigation problem. Diversion is the only possible local flood control measure that is practical. Beyond the existing system of drains and levees, city and army engineers crafted complex plans to build expensive dams, reservoirs, and diversion channels to protect the place from possible future losses caused by flooding. While these diversion channels never ended up being constructed due to the cost, a reservoir and dam were built as part of flood control projects during this time. Officials and experts came to study and analyze the flood problem in relation to economic concerns of property growth and navigation on one hand, as well as calculations related to rainfall, risk, and hydraulic engineering. This new regime was embedded within a developmental vision which was fundamentally urban, making questions of farming altogether marginal, with the city's growth instead tied to the ship channel. Importantly, drainage did not just become part of flood control, it also remained within the public works of the city. Modernization constituted a fracture within the governance of drainage in the city as it became divided between urban development and environmental management, with responsibility distributed between the city and the flood control authority. Drainage governance under the flood control regime continued to rely on land and property logic central to previous drainage governance. However, it was also influenced by an infrastructural vision that centered the protection of the Houston Ship Channel as critical for the city's future growth, with property interests expanding beyond the farmlands and fields that were central to drainage's past to encompass the profit and progress tied to the fossil fuel flow of global capital through the city's port. Now I want to come back to where we started to think about what this has to do with our present moment. Today, as the climate crisis intensifies risks of flooding in the city, activists for racial justice are working to challenge and reverse the state's neglect of drainage infrastructure in Houston's Black neighborhood. The hurricane disproportionately impacted Black and undocumented migrant communities in the region. Environmental justice activists are working to challenge the city's unequal legacies of urban development. Harvey revealed the inadequacy of the city's drainage infrastructure, particularly in minoritized neighborhoods. In 2023, for example, organizers with the Northeast Action Collective successfully fought to shift the burden of maintaining drainage infrastructure from property owners to the city, almost tripling investment in the local drainage program. Struggles for drainage justice continues, as this recent tweet from an environmental organization in the city argues, drainage justice is a key part of racial justice. In describing the processes that shaped the governance of Houston's drainage infrastructure in the early 20th century, I wanted to draw attention to the historical roots of environmental injustice in the city and how these previous processes and practices of governance produced political, spatial, and material inequalities. Working to legitimate the infrastructural abandonment of minoritized groups in the city, as well as erase Indigenous sovereignty and underdevelop and exclude Black neighborhoods. Like Carrie, I also echo that historical research often points to more problems than solutions. I'm also excited to hear from other folks today and learn from everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amani. And now we go to our third speaker, Despo Thoma.
Hi all. What a wonderful research and what great to be in your company. Dalia, I'll ask you to share your screen. Thank you. So we're gonna tag team this here. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the work that SCAPE is doing in Louisiana over the last 5-6 years. So who is SCAPE? SCAPE, in the next slide, we are landscape architects. We're architects, urban designers, planners, horticulturalists, and all of us together make SCAPE. We work across our 3 offices in the next slide, in New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco, on a variety of, landscape architecture projects, but also expanding into resiliency, climate, engagement, ecological planning, just far beyond your more traditional landscape architecture services. Next. So what I'd like to talk about today is, why does design for climate action matters? It's really a cornerstone of our practice. Next slide. So we've all seen the scary graphs. We've all seen the increasing sea level rise, temperatures, storm intensifying. This is an outdated already chart where we are here, it says, but we're so far beyond that line already. Next slide. So we understand that we operate in a context of these 3 really big challenges that we have to face. Climate change, but also habitat and biodiversity loss and social inequity. And all of those were very eloquently described by the 2 other panelists. So this is a great segue. Next. So we see landscape architecture as a model of design and maintenance that is based in science, art, and stewardship, rather than a luxury practice that sometimes remains invisible. Next. So what can design practice do? We work, in the next slide, to really work on this loop, this feedback loop between design and climate action, where advocacy work amplifies design and climate action, and each reinforces the other. Next slide. So in this next series of slides, Dalia can go through, we aim to revive landscape systems, we aim to forge connections, we aim to generate ecosystems, embrace the physical reality of the world around us, and also, in the next slide, engage people in the process. Next. An experiment, very important. So today I want to talk about our work with Dr. Don Bosch in Louisiana on this project called Our Future Coast, and also talk a little bit at the end of how this connects to the most recent work that we've done with the with CPRA, the state agency in Louisiana, for the 2023 Coastal Master Plan. Next. So we've all heard the statistics. We all heard how Louisiana's disappearing coast. It's rapidly losing land every hour, every year. Since the 1930s, Louisiana has lost over 2,000 square miles of land to the Gulf of Mexico due to the anthropogenic and environmental factors, a staggering loss exacerbated by climate change and intensifying storms. Next slide. We've also seen, we're all too familiar with how delicate this ecosystem is, how these swamps and marshlands blend the boundary between water and land. Next. And we've all seen these images from Hurricane Katrina, with the levees overflown and breaking into New Orleans. Next slide. As we know, Hurricane Katrina, strong winds really intensified the surge of the waters in 2005, showing how much this protective buffer of swamplands and ecosystems has degraded, and the sea level rise that we've experienced has intensified the storms that people experience. And if you're on the path of a hurricane, you're really facing severe consequences. So it was a very stark reminder. Next slide. So after Hurricane Katrina and Rita devastated coastal Louisiana in 2005, the Louisiana legislature created the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, or CPRA, tasking it to coordinate federal, state, and local restoration efforts. Since 2007, the CPRA has developed a series of coastal master plans to help evaluate and plan the wide variety of projects across the coast, harnessing the combined expertise of scientists, engineers, environmental professionals, policymakers, and Louisiana citizens to prepare for and respond to a climate changed future. Beyond the flood walls, in the next slide, you'll see so much of the effort has also been put in restoration. Groups like CRCL are really focusing on oyster reefs and rebuilding the beneficial landscapes around the coastal Louisiana, the coast of Louisiana. In the next slide, you'll see the connection with all the restaurants from New Orleans that are participating in the program to take and collect around over 7 million pounds of shells to be put into restoration efforts. Next slide. And that generates a narrative. It is an understanding, it is a thread, it is a connection between the life, the daily life, and the act of restoring, the act of making a process into the landscape. Next. So the Louisiana Coastal Master Plan, before this work, the latest iteration was out in 2017. And in the next slide, you'll see it was, really a call to action. With a sense of urgency, we have to face what a future without action might look like. And this phrase, future without action, really became an emblematic red map showing the potential land loss that Louisiana might face in a high scenario over the course of the next 50 years. So in the next slide, what would it look like if all of the work that the master plan proposes actually happens? It gets funded and it happens and it is successful. So in 2019, SCAPE collaborated with Dr. Don Bosch and the Walton Family Foundation to envision a future where Louisiana's coastal ecosystems and economies are even more bountiful than they are today. And the dual challenges of sea level rise and land loss are countered by restoration projects implemented at a regional scale. So the resulting vision, it was a collaboration between a renowned environmental scientist and SCAPE, and it seeks to describe what a best case scenario for the future of the Louisiana coast might look like. Next. So I will put in the chat for you all to also access, if you want, the resulting project led to the creation of a suite of deliverables, a website, but also a video to really outline what this alternative future might look like. So in the process of envisioning our future coast, we wanted to understand what within the bounds of science, what that would look like. In Dr. Bosch's own words, this vision of the future of the Louisiana Gulf Coast over the next 50 years was developed from a perspective of an environmental scientist with nearly a half century of experience in the diagnosis of and treatment of coastal environmental deterioration in various parts of the world. It was developed with the empathy of the native, the knowledge drawn from the extensive experience of the Louisiana coast, and objectivity afforded by having lived outside of the state for nearly 3 decades, and a perspective based on engagement in addressing environmental change at the regional scale. Next slide. So we wanted to set the stage, understand the urgency, but also wanted to talk about opportunities. So in the next series of slides, we wanted to go through the different ecological and economic opportunities that a positive vision can afford us. Is it giving you trouble, Dahlia? There we go. So we wanted to talk about how restoring the natural balance between the land and sea really benefits the landscapes and provides that value, that ecological value that we really need to create abundance and bounty in our systems. Next, we wanted to talk about the coastal economy and how it relies upon these 3 things, the location of it, the natural resources, but also tourism and that awareness that it brings with it. We wanted to envision this future coast that it will rely upon the same foundations. It won't retreat, it won't not be there, but it will be different in kind and changed by these emerging circumstances. Next. And we also wanted to talk about the fact that restoration at this scale might be costly, but spending the money now saves money over the long run and creates new jobs and economic opportunities. Next. I put the link in the chat to the video. You don't have to click that, Dahlia, we can keep going. Thank you. We wanted to frame how the master plan is a 50-year process, and it is really outlining what we can do within that time frame. Next. And we wanted to put forward a vision for a restored Barataria Basin. We took this basin by basin approach across the Louisiana coast and emphasized those 3 things that you see in color there: how to restore those dynamic ecosystems, how to foster an adaptation economy, and how to transition to decarbonization infrastructure. And then through the next slides, we can see some of those examples. So how to connect the river to the basin with diversions from the Mississippi River. Next. How to reduce barriers to flow. We observe that infrastructure such as roads and levees risk diminishing the hydrological connectivity and accelerating the conversion of forested wetlands to emergent wetlands or open water. Next. And also we wanted to create a new sediment source for these very beneficial and deprived landscapes. Next. We also wanted to acknowledge the adaptation economy that we're putting forward and preserve those saline pockets and strategically locate marsh creation behind the Grand Isle in order to moderate the freshening effect of river diversions in the southwestern part of the basin, allowing the users and the culturalists to enhance protection of the estuarine resources that they benefit from. Next. But also maintain navigation with sea level rise. As we know, all the channels are impacted, so how do we maintain that? Next. And reduce storm surge when critical. Next. Manage the barrier islands as a protective system. Next. And repurpose hydrocarbon extraction infrastructure and really look into the future of what that could look like. Next. So all that outlined in a transect to really revive the Louisiana coast 1 basin at a time. Next. And we can go quickly through, if you can flow through the next 3 slides, I think, of how all that looks, and it's available on the website to peruse at your own time. So all this work happened around 2019. We then worked with CPRA, with the Coastal Restoration Protection Authority of Louisiana, to develop a visual identity and a communication strategy for the 2023 Coastal Master Plan. So this plan, if you go to the next slide, it is a 50-year plan for a 50 billion investment in risk reduction and restoration projects. It happens every 6 years. This is the cycle that it follows. So it is due for an update in 2029. So everything builds, everything gets informed through this work, and it's a constant iteration of what do we do in the next 50 years. Next. It is a plan for the people, ideas and material to engage with communities through 200 touch points. So engaging with a large swath of stakeholders across the coast cannot happen in a simple map form. So what are the different ways that we can engage through different summary slides, stories, workshops, events? What are the ways to get to know the coast and incorporate people's ideas on what a future of the coast might look like? Next. The rubric of talking about this duality between a future without action and a future with action is really the backbone of this plan. It is a constant comparison of what not taking action will cost us in terms of money, but also in terms of quality of life and damages and just rapid change in our lifetime. And what a future with action might look like if we invest now in the right things to empower communities to become resilient and adapt over time. Next. And we wanted to really reframe the narrative from a narrative of land loss in red in the 2017 plan to a narrative of land change. So the state decided to move forward with a simple act of changing the red map to a blue and green map to talk about the story of change from green to land, but also to highlight with lime green here all of the positive land gains that have happened through the restoration work that has happened in the recent years. Next. And also, the state wanted to take a regional approach for this master plan. I would say inspired by the same need that Dr. Don Bosch wanted to take this basin by basin approach. The state understands that there are very different characteristics in the hydrology, but also in the communities and the culture and the ecosystems that different regions of the coast have. Therefore, solutions cannot be identical. Proposed projects cannot be identical. Next. Our work really aimed to support and inform local decision making. So a lot of the work asked the question, how do we scale down the available data that we have, really good available data, and package it in a way that it's the most useful to local decision makers in order to make the most informed decisions they can about their regions. Next. So we wanted to also really educate folks and explain how all of these different project types that are proposed as part of the master plan, what are their benefits, what are their components, how are they building systems over time, and really demonstrate the way that it's also providing ecosystem benefits in addition to job creations and other functions. Next. So more than a report, the 2023 master plan was, it was a 200-page document, but it was also videos, a data viewer that people can use on the field. It was a series of fact sheets and many more things. In the next slide, you'll see the use of the data viewer that included model projections for flood risk, vegetation change, but also all of the location of the projects outlined can be used on the field by people working in restoration work actively today. And in the next slide, we also took that information and we wanted to create a series of videos. I'll put that also in the chat so you have access to it. And I think we have one more slide that talks a little bit about the fact sheets that we created. We wanted to tailor the information to the scale of different communities, to the scale of the regions, the scale of the parishes, and also the scale of the projects. So if you have any questions, you can go find each individual fact sheet and make an informed decision about that. Next. We wanted to increase the legibility of the map. There's so much information to talk about. Next. Improve visual accessibility and ensure colorblind ability to read and distinguish the different types. Next. And there was a unanimous approval. The Louisiana House of Representatives unanimously approved the state's updated coastal master plan last year, paving the way for $50 billion worth of wetland restoration and storm protection projects over the next 50 years. And with that, I will leave you with this phrase. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all three of you, Carrie, Amani, and Despo. We are open for questions. Feel free to type your questions in the chat, and I will read out the questions to all three speakers. While we wait for the question, I would jump in and ask my first question I think it's connected to all three of you, but Carrie, you spoke about deprivation, right? Could you expand on it? I know of deprivation of property, but you spoke about it in terms of law, right? Could you expand, labor, sorry. You spoke about it in terms of labor, if I got it correctly. Could you expand on that and how it was connected to property?
Sure, thank you for the question. I think I'm looking at deprivation in two ways. So one is kind of depriving other people from being able to access land by making it property. So that kind of idea of exclusive use and benefit as opposed to use and benefit for all. And then I'm also thinking of deprivation in terms of these kind of consistent requirements to build in order to make land property. We value property so much economically, culturally, kind of societally, but it can't be made by law without building something on it, or at least that's how, residentially speaking. And so I think we're depriving the environment by kind of letting it be natural, by letting it be, by building upon it, but also depriving other people from enjoying it when we make it property.
And where does labor come into the picture?
Sure. I think of labor as kind of the person who has to build or the person who has to exclude. It's almost like the act of exclusion, the act of making architecture is, especially residential architecture, is labor that we are rewarded with in the context of the United States, and even more so in some of the other kind of with the other overlapping legislations.
Yeah, that was super interesting. And I think it matched, it crossed over with some things that Amani spoke about wasteland, right? The idea of wasteland, that first land is called wasteland, and then the wetlands are called wastelands, right, Amani? And then it becomes, is that what you, could you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think basically across different contexts from like India and also the US, you see this idea of swamps as like these filthy sites which are spreading disease and not only wasteful but also harmful. So that kind of helps mobilize a lot of resources towards eliminating swamplands, but at the same time, and there's a book by the historian Deepa Bhattacharya which examines these dynamics in Bengal. So it's in a much further part of the world, but somehow feels still quite resonant in different ways. Yeah, so at the end of the day, even though the kind of justification is in this language of public health, what's happening is it's creating real estate or property, like Carrie's talking about. So I think there definitely is a kind of similar kind of function of property and kind of how it's legitimated by the state.
Despo, does that come across in current projects? This question of first identifying something that is swampy as wasteland or bad for health, and then making that into private private property. Did you see that anywhere in Louisiana? I'm very curious if it still happens, because it happens in Mumbai even now. Yeah, go ahead.
I think people's experience with their landscape, it's not something you're taught for the most part. It's something you just experience. You grow up, there's mosquitoes, that's irritating. I think through a multiplicity of experiences and a multiplicity of interactions with that landscape, a lot of the fundamental ecological benefits that they carry come through, either through time, either through experiences, either through the absence of those benefits when we no longer have them. So I think it is becoming commonplace that the loss of wetlands, the loss of swamplands has afforded us less cushioning against those increasing storm events, those increasing forces that we have to face from time to time. So I will say it is not one thing, it is not one label. It is a multiples identities, and we can engage with those on many levels. We can choose to restore, we can choose to rebuild those ecological functions. And also, okay, yeah, there might be a mosquito here and there, but that's a sign of a very, very healthy ecosystem. So I think there is a change there for sure.
Dahlia, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sorry, I was just like trying to
Yeah,
read this. Yeah, I'm kind of curious because the way I see this, we build these processes of engineering and kind of managing and dreaming the swamplands that we see, and then now Despo's practice and what they're trying to do in Louisiana is reverse some of that and rebuild some of those lost swamplands and some of the damage that was done throughout these years of processes. And I'm wondering, because the original process was aimed at the kind of economic value of creating property. And now, even when Despo was presenting their plan and kind of master plan and project, it has to tie to some economic benefit. But I assume the ownership of these new lands will be public, right? And it will be part of this like maintenance process. That will be the jobs, right, Despo? Or how do you envision that process?
That's a really good question. New land, who owns it? I would say, yeah, it's probably public. But I think I would say the difference in context is that we are now in a rapidly changed environment where the status quo we have here now today, it's simply not an option to keep what we have, avoid any losses, avoid any damages, and just keep. Things will change. So we are now comparing things to a future where no action is taken. That is a costly future. There is a price tag to doing nothing. And then there is a price tag to do something. I think that changes the conversation. I think 100 years ago, the processes that you all very eloquently described, there wasn't this sort of future price tag, a price tag on our future that we had to evaluate things against.
And it just brings up the way Dahlia explained it, that we're reversing the process. But to just say that in my own research in Mumbai, I'm seeing that that reversal is producing private land in an odd way. That kind of private land, in the sense that that we are doing something for the ecosystem, is also a way of, especially in one city in India where they have created public spaces that speak of this sort of work, but at the same time, prices around it are going up. It's gentrifying the areas around it, just because this has become some sort of cool thing to speak about. So I often wonder, that process that you spoke about, Dahlia, very nicely, that we're reversing it, but we have to be careful about when you're reversing what happens to that land again, right? And as Despo, you said, I'm sure it's public land in Louisiana. I think there are no other questions. unless you want to, unless the panelists have questions for each other, or Dahlia wants to add something else.
Yeah, I had, well, there's one question from Chris Davenport, but that's pretty similar to what we discussed. Is basically, how do we make sure we do not repeat mistakes of the past in terms of social inequities and land distribution with the new environmentally protective approach? And I think it's kind of part of the challenge of, I guess, reversing everything. We're reversing infrastructure, but also revising policy and some of these mechanisms. The question is, when does it become too entangled or too complex to reverse it? Because I'm thinking about like the urban landscape of Houston and how some of the drainage systems are kind of embedded within whatever we have there. Because even Despo, like your work on the coastal plan, it's mainly on the edges, right? It's mainly on the kind of
On the
edge of
coastal
the coast.
Louisiana.
It doesn't go inland to.
It goes just by definition of how much of the coast of Louisiana is impacted. It goes a lot, further inland, but it is dealing with coastal issues. It is affecting urban centers. I think just to my reaction to the question, which was so well put, it's the ability to have options and not be left without options and having to go down a path of adaptation or enduring risk. I think putting forward ideas, putting forward a vision, giving folks all the necessary tools in terms of information science in a comprehensible way, in a simple way that people can engage with, allows people to make informed decisions for their own lives and choose the path of adaptation that makes the most sense for their livelihoods, their communities, their immediate neighborhoods, their neighbors, their families. I think that's a very different conversation from a conversation where exploitation and gain force one way of adapting or force one way of enduring risk, that you have no say in how you experience that. So I think options is really, really key.
I have a question, Despo, for you. So when you presented this project to the state of Louisiana, right, to state officials in Louisiana, what do you think are the ways, as you said, these processes will be different in different places, right? You cannot adapt what you did in Louisiana, in Houston, in Texas, or any other place. These are uniquely local. What do you think is the deterrent for this project to transfer to other states? Like, why doesn't it happen more? Why isn't it more widespread? Why isn't it more widespread?
And are you referring to sort of more of the visioning work with Dr. Bosch, or more of the master plan that the state is doing?
Master plan. Like when I look at it, I'm wondering, when there is such great options, why doesn't it happen more often? What is the reason? What are the deterrents that you think states feel to want to do something like this?
What are the deterrents? Great question. I don't think there are. I think there are ways of doing things, and then a state is forced to do things in a new way when a catalyst emerges, a crisis emerges. And Louisiana went through that a number of times and implemented new processes to outline the future. It is a very attainable precedent for so many states in the Gulf Coast. I don't think it's far-fetched. I don't think it's something that's still being tested. CPRA has been doing this work since 2007. There's lessons learned. There are incredible people that do this work that can share the ins and outs and the lessons learned and the processes that went into it. But it is something that we may take for granted in Louisiana. And we may need to amplify the advocacy for this work, how vital it is for this work to remain and to be enhanced, and to not sort of become complacent in the fact, oh, we figured it out. It's all good and done. We don't need this anymore. No, the point is that this is a living process, that it is an ongoing process. And through advocating for that work to really be enhanced in Louisiana, I think we are also advocating for that work to be expanded in other states. And I think that would be a greatly beneficial thing to happen.
So Kieran Renfro has a question. My original question was what we were speaking about currently, but now I'm intrigued with wondering if the group knows of successful reformations, reframing projects that have managed to successfully reconcile marginalized communities alongside their environments alike. We often see a polarity with these projects, like mentioned, where the restoration is extremely successful, but the community once again feels astronomical detrimental effects from doing so. So I think the question is trying to say, do you know of any such successful projects? And how do you speak about the polarity between projects that are successful, but the community once again feeling effects of having done the project? Does anyone want to take the question? Maybe I think, Despo, if you have any other projects, successful reformations, reframing.
I would definitely cite the Coalition to Restore the Louisiana Coast, CRCL, for their great work that they're doing in terms of restoration. That's work, and many other local organizations, work that it's being advanced through these community advocacy groups, organizations. It has such a strength in bringing community voices, advocating for what's needed to be done. But I would also highlight for us what does it mean to feel the positive or negative impacts of a protection or restoration project. I think sometimes the connection is obvious. There is a giant flood wall or a levee built 5 blocks from my house that will keep the waters out up to a level. That's obvious. You can see that. But I don't know that restoring a barrier beach out far into the Gulf Coast, it is something that you can draw the line from a day-to-day experience to your home and say, I am one-to-one benefiting from that. But you're definitely benefiting as a system, as a whole. So, those lines get very blurry sometimes. So it's about understanding the systems and understanding how one project plays a part in a larger system as a whole.
There's one more question from Angel Abriel Leos. How do you believe the differences in the definition of a crisis impact the restoration of our local marginalized community, especially? This is, I think he's asking, the way you define the crisis kind of shapes how the restoration that happens. Do you think the definition of the crisis, when it happens, like Katrina or any other crisis, has it shaped how restoration has worked in local communities? I would say yes, but I would want the panelists to kind of, because the definition of crisis kind of shapes who gets involved and how much money is put into it and who it affects, right?
Yeah, I wonder if Amani can talk to that,
Yeah.
because she kind of points out 2 moments in history, with the boy that drowned in the 20s in the 3rd ward, and then the flood in downtown.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. It also made me think of what Despo was saying about how today we have this sense that the cost of not acting is very high. But I think actually there was the same sense even in 1935 in Houston when downtown was flooded. And it's very clear who had control over the narrative of defining the crisis. When I was in the archives, I came across this kind of, it was like a document, I think circulated maybe by the Houston Chamber of Commerce or something like that, outlining the real estate costs basically of the flood and, what building damage, and like putting like dollar amount on it. And there was a real sense that if this happens again, it's going to be very expensive for the very lucrative kind of financial district that was affected by the flood. So I think that's why you see like the port and these kind of folks having a really strong role, and even like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in responding. And of course, I think there are also different national kind of forces beyond just the city. But I think if you're looking at what changed today, I would say it's really like social movements and like environmental justice organizing, which has brought attention to the need to think about these kind of questions of inequalities. And also we're seeing how I think there was a faith in technology and engineering that we can build a wall big enough to save us. But I think now people know that that maybe isn't the case. Although I know they're still constructing seawalls, but maybe there needs to be a different approach. So I would say maybe these two things. And especially like with Louisiana, I think during the Katrina moment, I think as much as that brought out how levees can fail, it also brought out how much inequality shaped the way the state responded. And even today, I mean, there are Katrina refugees who are mostly Black folks. And I think in some way that the activism and organizing of that time also informs the way these plans are coalescing now.
I really liked what you said, that even in 1935, there was that sense of emergency and alarm. Is that what you said when this happened? So it's like this whole newness to every discourse, while you know that it has happened before and it has happened many times before. So what did you say? So there was dollar amounts attached to, could you just talk a little bit about that, the point you made about that the destruction was connected to a dollar amount? Is that what you said?
I think so. It's like in the back of my mind, but yeah, I do remember coming across this like document that was it was kind of trying to get more funding for flood control, because of course it is very expensive, and it was doing that really by emphasizing that this is like an expensive problem that we need to protect against, and to make it like the cost of investment seem pragmatic to bureaucrats.
Kind of answering the earlier question, right? What is the deterrent? To kind of make it sound pragmatic, maybe the answer for it. Any last questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Carrie, Despo, and Amani, for really great research. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else did too. Have a good evening, and hopefully pragmatic decisions happen in the future, and hoping for a better Houston. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.